Okay, so next big piece of the classical era is trade routes. So you have really four major trade routes here, um, kind of in the classical era. You know them already. You know those pretty well. You have the Silk Roads, which goes through China to Central Asia. It's the red lines really on this map here. And it stretches all the way to the very, very border of Western Europe and the Roman Empire. Uh, and it really connects the Han Dynasty of China with the Romans. So as Han and Rome are often talked about together because of that reason when you talk about classical empires. You also have the Indian Ocean Trade Network here in the light blue, and there's also the Trans-Saharan Trade Network here in West Africa. There's the Mediterranean Sea trade routes utilized by the Roman Empire, Carthage, city-states of North Africa. And then there's Eurasian trade routes here in the purple. These are kind of just lesser kind of discussed, but there are like some just overland trade routes, a little smaller, not quite as extensive as the Silk Roads, um, but they are not as known as much for the movement of luxury items as the Silk Roads are, but they do exist. We tend to focus on the Silk Roads, the Trans-Saharan, and the Indian Ocean, and to some extent the Mediterranean Sea, which, by the way, remember, Mediterranean Sea right here. This is it, between Africa and Europe. Okay. So let's talk trade routes specifically. Um, Start with Silk Roads. Silk Roads is known for a spread of Buddhism, essentially, right? Especially in the classical era. Buddhism starts here in India, but with merchants trading and with merchants kind of traveling and moving around, India is not too far from the Silk Road, so you can see how it would be easy to um, have a Buddhist merchant or a monk kind of wandering around end up on the Silk Roads. So Buddhist merchants um, or many merchants find or encounter Buddhism on the Silk Roads. Um, as you know, there are monasteries set up at various points on the Silk Roads at the oasis cities where they offer rest and supply and food to people and merchants, especially who are traveling on the Silk Roads. So the Silk Roads is also known as a relay system. So the Silk Road's quite long here, obviously. So there's no merchant that as it wasn't common anyway for the merchants to travel from point A here in China all the way to the Mediterranean. It was a relay system where a merchant would start here and travel to here, do their trading, hand off the goods to a merchant in this particular oasis city, and then that merchant would continue the trade over to here for the second leg of the journey, and then do a trade, and then have the last merchant deliver those goods all the way over to Western Europe or the Mediterranean region. There is a conflict with the Silk Roads, in terms of bringing Buddhism into China. Buddhism is not well received by the Confucian scholars initially, so that is another effective trade routes, kind of bringing unwelcome ideas, but it happens nonetheless. The Silk Roads are a reason they're really enabled by empires who provide protection for merchants who trade on these trade routes. All right, so the empires provide protection and make trade happen here. There's also forms of credit that develop along each of these trade routes, where merchants can exchange an equal value of something um, with different forms of credit. There's also bank houses along the Silk Roads and all these other trade networks um, that allow merchants to store money and keep records and that kind of thing. One thing that's important about credit is you have to remember merchants on the Silk Roads and other trade networks are literally from all over the world. So they have different coinage or different money. If they, though, use credit, they are able to trade equally, or with equal amounts of things. Also on the Silk Roads, I'm just having a blank for a second. Why am I forgetting my ideas? So Silk Roads have another important piece where they're also, oops, sorry about that. Silk Roads also stretched the Roman Empire, so there's a great diffusion here, cultural diffusion, spread of religion, spread of goods, spread of people to different parts of the world. So cultural diffusion, also a major element of trade networks, okay? The trade networks of West Africa, the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, you see the spread of religion here. Remember, Islam is primarily spread here, so the Trans-Saharan, the major effect of the spread of Islam, remember, Islam is not until the post-classical era. That does not happen until 600 CE. So even though the trade networks of the Trans-Saharan are in existence here in the classical era, a lot of the major occurrences of, or like that are the well-known, like important things that happen because of the Trans-Saharan Trade Network really happen in the post-classical era. So I'll talk more about the Trans-Saharan Trade Network in the post-classical era, but that is something that's developing here. One thing that the Silk Roads and the Trans-Saharan have in common is that they're also enabled by the domestication of animals, specifically the camel. Camel is actually originates here in Central Asia, but because the trade networks and because the camels are so strong and go so long without water and can carry so much, they do eventually find home here in the Middle East and in North Africa because there's desert regions here. The geography of the Silk Roads area is mountainous, dry, and cold, but there are also deserts, just colder deserts with little rain. So it's cold and dry, whereas in this area of the world, where here in the Middle East and North Africa and West Africa, it's just dry and hot. So camels, though, can survive in either element. All right. Also, Indian Ocean Trade Network, a little different because it's a sea-based or water-based trade route, right? So, what is the kind of goods that are traded here are a little different. There is more bulk and common items in this Indian Ocean area. There are ships being developed that can carry just a lot more things, like timber, heavier items that maybe just aren't as desirable, but more people can get involved in these Indian Ocean trade networks because the goods are cheaper to be sold. In the Trans-Saharan and the Silk Roads, the merchants have to be wealthy to do this because they're trading luxury goods like silk and porcelain and spices and slaves and animal skins and ivory and even some gold items here. We're talking Africa. But those things there are luxury goods here, like especially spices from India, like cinnamon and pepper and other spices here from Southeast Asia. But there's also more common bulk goods. Like I said, timber can be sold in large quantities is one example. Indian Ocean Trade Network is enabled by technology, specifically the early development of the compass and other shipping, kind of navigational devices created. That's something that continues on into the post-classical era as well. What's important to note here is that the Indian Ocean Trade Network gives rise to political development in that there are several, like wherever you see the blue line here landing on the coast of a place, that is where a major city developed. So the Indian Ocean leads to the development of cities that rise to become great trading centers and great like bustling cities and powerful cities in the world in the Indian Ocean region. These are not necessarily places that become empires. Actually, it's literally just city-states that rise here. And so merchants become merchants from this area, or these many areas of the Indian Ocean Trade Network, Southeast Asia, China, India, Middle East, East Africa. They actually start to identify and kind of with the cities that they come from and trade with, instead of like their home countries or their home like empire or whatever you want to call it. But actually, this is known for not development of empires, but development of cities. So there's important cities. You should know some examples. Like there is one place here called Mogadishu in Somalia. There is Srivijaya here in Southeast Asia. There's several important cities, but those are two of them. The Indian Ocean Trade Network exchanges a bunch of different religions. It's responsible for a lot of cultural diffusion, specifically the Indian South Asian religions of Buddhism, Hinduism, spread specifically to Southeast Asia. Islam, like I said, and again, more in the post-classical era, but ultimately Islam does spread from Africa and the Middle East throughout this region as well into China and Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of cultural diffusion for these empires, that these trade networks are responsible for. And so, just to summarize, with trade networks, you see the spread of religion. You see the helps enable empires to rise. Empires, remember, tax trade that's going on, and they're able to rise to authority and profit from trade networks. The spread of goods. This is one early instance of globalization, these trade networks, because they connect many different parts of the world. If you're thinking about more like specific things here. One example of an empire that rises due to trade is this small, tiny area over here. There is a city called Srivijaya, Srivijaya, here in Indonesia, that is established because of this trade here. And what they do to become even more powerful, to become a more powerful kingdom, is they tax this little waterway right here, right where this little blue line goes through. That's called the Strait of Malacca. And Indian and Chinese merchants who want to sail through here into the other part of China use this strait. And so the Srivijayans tax the use of this strait and become incredibly wealthy because of it. So that's just one example of a city that's become a very powerful kingdom. Political development in the Indian Ocean Trade Network is an impact as well, especially in the of cities in the Indian Ocean region. So, based on what you've been told here, what are the major impacts of trade networks, and also what are the enabling factors of trade networks? Think about that, write your notes yourself, and then we'll move on to religions.